For the last couple of weeks of the discussions, we actually compressed 4 of these talks into 2, so we'll have the break halfway through, but I'll try and sort of hurry things along a bit today, because inevitably the compression involves some brevity, and I edited the images so we get the 2 areas of discussion into the one session. And the first of these was about divided cities, and the second was about cities as arenas of and generators of war. So in a sense, we're really having a look at the dystopic components of the history of urban form today in various aspects. And I suppose it's never been completely absent from these discussions, as you're probably aware, and we'll have a look also at how specific buildings relate to patterns of urbanism that are involved in these particular issues. Now, again, I'd suggest, by way of the films and the readings, certainly the idea of Joe Kalama and Esther Charlesworth's Divided Cities, in which there's a study made of a series of divided cities, of which there seem to be a depressingly large number, and they're not looking at the entirety of them either. They're not looking at Berlin, for example, and they're not having a look at a number of other divided cities, even just in Europe. In terms of films, certainly, as you can see, we've mentioned a number here. Blade Runner's cropped up before, but certainly Romper Stomper in terms of Melbourne as a communally divided city, with differing ethnicities, different migrant communities, and with the sort of reactions by the older Anglo-Irish population that characterise very much the experience of Britain and the United States. You can see played out in Romper Stomper, which was made in the early 1990s with Russell Crowe as a leading sort of figure in a neo-Nazi faction based in Footscray. City of God was also particularly about the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, and is also worth looking at. It's quite a ferocious, quite a devastating sort of film, and it tracks the development of the favelas and the development of a complete sort of dislocation within Rio through to the present day. The Lives of Others is interesting because it was a recreation of life from the inside of the Stasi in East Berlin prior to unification. It was a very moving film in which, as I recall, yes, the leading protagonist of the film gets sent to some sort of Siberia, which I think was the letter steaming office or something like that, which was in deep in the heart of the Stasi headquarters in East Berlin, and how it sort of tracks his career through to eventual unification, and now he sort of walks the streets of a different city. Odd Man Out, Carol Reed, 1947, made, I think, either just before or just after The Third Man, and it's very much a film noir sort of set in a devastated or partly devastated city, in the sense that Belfast was just close enough to get some air raids, but also was the arena for Republican and for aggressive Protestant activity, and it traces the career of a bank robbery that goes wrong in a particularly gloomy and grimy Belfast of the early post-war period. That's of relevance because we'll have a look at some images from Belfast today. In terms of TV series, I think you could probably sort of conceive a whole series that are divided cities in any way, but I thought The Wire sprang to mind almost immediately. The old series Hill Street Blues had a lot of almost sort of network characteristics to it in terms of sops to people's attention spans and so on, but particularly in its first 3 series from about 1981 onwards, it was really quite startling, quite devastating in the degree to which it actually pictured a United States, an urban United States that was literally falling apart. And it was the first series. Stephen Bochco was the producer. It was really, I think, the first series to actually do that. All right. Now, divided cities. I was going to go through a series of aspects of social division. There are obviously going to be social layerings, and layerings of all sorts. And we've encountered this particularly, discussing some of the images last week are going to be, sort of resonate quite strongly with the sort of images that you find now. There was the issue of static communal groups and how these might either be maintained or overthrown. The link between communal groups and religion becomes a major factor, and other forms of social identification. This is almost a second area. There's a third area, which is the issue of underclasses and the broader issue of class tensions which arise within cities from that. The fourth was the issue of capitalistic and technocratic ascendancies. There's kind of an overclass that's sort of sitting above. 5 is the issue of criminality and delinquency. And 6 was how one responded to these issues and these problems, whether you accommodated them or whether you lived with them in various sorts of ways, or whether you allowed dystopia to just sort of unfold. And the obvious alternatives were really the vision of Los Angeles in the future in Blade Runner, and that extraordinary capacity of American culture to live with states of undeclared warfare within their cities, or the idea of radically changing cities on the basis of ideal or idealist forms, and what that involved, and indeed how revolutionary that was, or whether indeed, as Corbusier concludes his book Towards a New Architecture, whether it was going to be architectural revolution, and his argument was revolution can be avoided, which is more or less, I suppose, the argument within Fritz Lang's Metropolis, if people could be brought together. Now, I was going to just have a look at some of the ways in which urban divisions are manifested. And I guess the first characteristic you might find is vertical divisions unfolding over a period of time, especially where cities find themselves being rebuilt after disasters or wars. This is perhaps the oldest of the palpable divisions within cities that we experience, and the case in point being Troy, which is in Turkey near the Bosporus. It was near Istanbul. It was already, of course, around the world. It had gained a semi-mythical significance thanks to Homer's sagas of the epics of Troy, which were based on a Mycenaean-era war between Trojans and Greeks, which took place somewhere around about 1184 to 1334 BC. That is 1334 through sometime between then and 1184 BC, and involved in particular Troy 7a, which was one of a series of manifestations of Troy. I think it was, as I recall, this one here. So the realm of Achilles and of Hector, as narrated by Homer in 800 BC, which was several hundred years after the actual event, was related to what's now called Troy 7a, and the various layers of Troy stacked one on top of another, finally metamorphosing into a Roman city at the top, a Roman provincial city at the top, was the work of Heinrich Schliemann and his wife, and they worked there for years, from the 1860s through to about 1879. And Schliemann's work there, that's Schliemmann, became the foundation really for the whole sort of 19th century German archaeological enterprise that resulted, of course, in the Miletus Gate, in the altar of Pergamon, and in the Lion Gate of Babylon, then being taken back and reassembled in Berlin in the so-called Museum in central Berlin from the 1860s through to about the 1890s or around 1900. Now, the idea that cities could just be replaced one after the other, this characterised, I think, too, some of the Mesopotamian cities, which also had this sort of layering one on top of another, and it relied a lot on siltation and on the idea of just sort of natural erosion and geological, geomorphic change, as much as disasters, as much as the customary wars and earthquakes that seem to have pervaded ancient Near East civilizations and European civilizations. But you also find vertical ordering in another context as well, and that is in almost the instant creation of vertical ordering which you get in modern cities, or the development of modern cities. One of the probable sources for the imagery which Fritz Lang used for his sets, constructed in a few days for Metropolis, was Moses King's imaging of New York, which was done in the 1900s and which was publicised on a series of postcards. Here's Moses King's vision of New York, which, as I recall, was also used by Rem Koolhaas in Delirious New York. Koolhaas being a fanatical collector of postcards, and I remember having an interview with him in London in about 1978 when he was telling me all about the different New York sources for postcards which you could get. So it was a very major source of archival material for him and for visual imagery, and he ploughed it almost instantly into the book Delirious New York, which came out later that year in 1978. And here's Moses King's vision. But it's very much a vision based on ranking and hierarchy, so that clearly the higher up you got in a corporate system, the higher up you were in the skyscraper patterning of New York. The lower down in the order you were, you're probably going to end up underneath the L train at some particular point as well. And that's a social characteristic which persists in some American cities through to this day, particularly when, for example, the New York subway comes out of the ground, as it does at about 125th Street, and you suddenly get the character of areas being shaped, often generating self-perpetuating poorer areas of New York under the influence of L trains running over the top of streets and shaping them adversely, at least in the eyes of financiers and bankers. So you had the idea of vertically divided cities, and Metropolis is very much about the vertical divisions of society as reflected in architectural structure. Hence Freder, F-R-E-D-E-R, and his family live up the top of the towers in those sort of Startkorner components of the metropolis, of this dystopic metropolis of the future, whereas an underclass army of workers live underground literally, and then are sort of hauled to the surface in giant lifts and move off to work almost like automatons. To some extent too, you can find this in the utopian envisagings of high architectural modernism. It's often been argued, for example, that Corbusier's city of 3 million, despite, as you can see, a clear debt to Renaissance ideal cities, you can almost see the forms of Alberti or Filarete and of other almost utopian projections of urban form from the Italian Renaissance just coming into that city, with a piazza which has now become an airfield dominated by farming biplanes which are presumably take off and sail in and out amongst those towers, a bit as used to happen at Hong Kong in the old days, and where you then had a technocratic elite who would come in from the suburbs outside. They would work in these towers, in these cruciform towers. They would sort of perform the vital functions of powering the city, and then they would go home at the end of the day. And as we know, in Corbusier's vision, they would go home to start punching bags or swimming up and down swimming pools and doing all of those sort of physical things that Corbusier desired people to do. And during the day, they would be followed through their day by this underclass of cleaners and of technical assistants and of people who would just literally come in and clean up after them as they moved around the city from one point to the other. Charles Jenks highlighted this particularly in his Modern Movements in Architecture, arguing that it was part of, he saw it almost as an ideological blind spot on Corbusier's part, given that Corbusier was nominally at least aligned with utopian socialism, and where did that fit in utopian socialism? And I think it was probably a point that was being picked up on by Fritz Lang in Metropolis. But you find this in other projections of ideal cities as well. For example, Ludwig Hilbersheimer, that's Hilbersheimer, who was the author of major history of modern architecture. He projected cities of a similar character. In this case, as you can see, a stratified city in which he devotes a lot more attention to the idea of multi-level walkways, vehicular passageways of all sorts, and means of movement round about in between what are almost sort of deliberately neutral buildings that are figured as deliberately neutral spheres for the enactment of ideology, kinetic ideology in cities of the future. And at the same time, you can't help feeling that there must be an underclass that's really pushing all of this and sort of pushing it along, governing its development and its unfolding. Now we'll come back to related images of that with Richard Neutsch's rush city ideas, which were developed from his experience in the United States in the late 1920s. But you can see just how long established this idea of internal divisions was. Just to return again to Alexandria, for example, which is looking at around about Hypatia's time in the 5th century AD, you can see that there's a Jewish quarter which has emerged here. The Macedonians are next to the Jewish population there. The Romans seem to have been pushed off over to this section here. They seem to have been kept well clear of the general city, which was a pattern that the Americans employed in their bases and their settlements in Australia during World War II, when they desired to keep for a significant amount of the time, they desired to keep their personnel well away from Australian cities for a number of different reasons. Inside you also get, as you can see, the mosques and the Muslim quarter are actually a forward projection, given that the Muslim culture in Alexandria didn't really arise until 2 or 3 centuries afterwards. But you get another Roman enclave down here. You get a Christian enclave over in this section here, and Christians, Neoplatonists, and those subscribing to Roman religion were very much at war with each other within the city in the 5th century. And then, of course, you have the harbour out here, as you can see. So in other words, there was a significant degree of communal division that was inbuilt into Alexandria by this time. And you'll find this again and again, that cities will have a particular component. They will have a Muslim component, or they will have another religious component. New York particularly, and American cities become marked by very strong communalism, so that the immigrant population to the United States, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, remains very much focused on and concentrated in particular areas of American cities. It's not a phenomenon that we've experienced to anything like the same degree in Australia, where traditionally the Italian area of Carlton dispersed into Melbourne suburbs. The Greek regions of Richmond, particularly around Bridge Road, have again dispersed into suburbs. It'll be interesting to see how this works with the Vietnamese population, which also has a big enclave currently in Richmond, but where there are also other nodes with big Vietnamese and Cambodian populations, and with some Korean populations in Springvale and Box Hill and Footscray and a number of other areas. But in the United States, it was still possible to say this was the Latin Quarter, or as in New York with Little Italy, or that there were very strong Jewish quarters, as with the Upper West Side in New York City. There was a Chinatown in New York. And even in places like New Haven in Connecticut, which only had about 250,000 or 300,000 people, when I was there, there was still a Polish quarter, which was on the east side of the railway line. There was an Italian quarter, which was next to that, and they would end abruptly between one block and another. And hence the relevance of a film like Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, which was suggested as a film which again suggests this idea of urban division and how it erupts literally into a kind of urban warfare during one of those long hot summers in Brooklyn, New York, given that Brooklyn was divided along similar lines. So communalism is a major factor within divided cities. That's the general term which describes it. In other words, continued ethnic divisions of cities which don't significantly change over time. And this has been a long-standing characteristic in American cities, and it's one area which I think marks out our own ex-colonial experience as significantly different from that of the United States. You merely have to think of the ethnic divisions which abound in, and the solidity of those that abound even in a more recent city like Los Angeles, where most of the development would have been 20th century. Now, last week I also discussed the idea of actually one could map cities in terms of social improvement. But I think the other aspect of mapping cities in that way, and I'm thinking particularly of Charles Booth's Life and Labour of the People of London, is that once again you get just the sharpness of the social divisions, that you get the wealthy section of the London West End circling Hyde Park over here, with Green Park and Regent's Park immediately to the north. And then you get the black areas, that is, of extreme poverty, crime and delinquency, and there would be a link between criminality in London and financial poverty. And these are marked out particularly the London East End. There's the City of London, the financial district. There's the present-day retail district. You get, in this case, Mayfair here, Soho here, and then Holborn and Bloomsbury around here. Then you get into Bethnal Green, Seven Dials, Hoxton, Homerton, Whitechapel, all those parts on the monopoly board, like the Old Kent Road or Commercial Road here, the Old Kent Road running down here, South London, Southwark here, and Bermondsey, reaching round to Bermondsey here. So in other words, there is this quite elaborate subdivision of London into social regions. Now, the degree to which those regions would be transformed, it was assumed, I think, in Charles Booth's mapping of London that this was a transformable condition. But you also get in the mapping and the patterning of European cities the idea that, in fact, ethnic separation, economic separation, religious separation might actually be permanently established and continuing. And to some extent that was cemented into the ideas of those cities that were being put forward by Leon Battista Alberti and by Filarete and others in the Renaissance. So in a sense, the mapping of Venice's ghetto, which was one of the first instances in which the Italian word ghetto was applied to separate ethnicity within large Italian cities, that this is more or less solidified by the 18th century and could be mapped quite accurately on this 20th century map here. If you're familiar with Venice, there's the railway station down there, Grand Canal going round there, Rialto Bridge over here, and the ghetto is just sort of flanking the railway station on the north side, just, as I say, fairly close to the railway station, the points of access that Venice had to the land across its various bridges. Now, the celebration of a Jewish life in Venice goes back a long way in various perspectives. If you think, for example, of Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, a great deal of it revolves around the other, the positioning of Jews such as Shylock as a kind of Venetian other. And it persists in literature almost as a sort of continuing trope, in that Anthony Trollope, in his political novels, particularly The Palaces and so on, would have various luxurious and often ne'er-do-well British parliamentarians who would run out of money, and they would have to go to the Jews, because Jewish people were allowed to trade and speculate on monetary value, whereas traditionally this had been something that had been banned in the Christian church. And it became a major avenue by which Jewish populations were isolated and distinguished within European cities from the medieval period onwards. Here's an 18th century depiction of the ghetto in Venice, in which, as you can see, there's been clearly a sort of an outline of street typology, gardens, courtyards and so on, which are fairly standard in Italian experience, but where there's been a real attempt to chart a religiously and ethnically distinct area. And this remained an object of fascination all through the 19th century, particularly with massive waves of Jewish immigration and of Eastern European immigration to the United States. This accelerated in the late 19th century with anti-Semitism and with a whole series of pogroms, so-called, P-O-G-R-O-M, led against Jewish communities in cities, particularly in Russian-controlled sections of Eastern Europe. And it was not unknown in the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well, but in fact there had been sort of widespread rioting against Jewish populations, which ran back even to York in England in the 14th century, where there was a large massacre. Here you see postcards being gathered of New York City in the 1900s. As you can see, for example, with Mulberry Street in New York, photographed around about the 1900s, and it really is a depiction of literally Eastern Europe's tired, poor, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and so they've come to New York City. And in the process, they lend an identity to sections of New York, particularly Lower Manhattan, which is where this image was taken. There's a postcard, The Ghetto, New York, and it's number 5102, in which once again you can see that part of New York City is now characterised by ethnicity and by religion. It's also characterised in terms of its relative poverty and of issues of urban crime and urban delinquency, and how in fact this fits into general American aspirations, or how it sits alongside general American aspirations of financial prosperity and social propriety. You could also, of course, argue that something similar was happening in Afro-America, particularly after the great migrations which occurred in the wake of the American Civil War during the 1880s and the 1890s, particularly when we began to get a massive influx of African American populations up into northern states, into what are now the Rust Belt states. They were drawn northwards by prospects of working in industry. There was a very good documentary of life in New York in these lower Manhattan regions called Crossing Delancey, which was a reference to crossing one of the crucial streets in the lower Manhattan ghetto areas as a sort of a depiction. It was almost sort of anticipated the Burns brothers documentaries, using contemporary photographs and bringing them to life through constant juxtaposition and through an overlay of interviews and commentary. In Europe, you get the phenomenon of ghettos being marked out in cities in all sorts of ways. The medieval fortress boundary around Frankfurt am Main. Why it's often called Frankfurt am Main is because there were two Frankfurts. There's Frankfurt an der Oder, which is over in the eastern section of Saxony near the present Polish border. But Frankfurt am Main, or Frankfurt/Main, is of course the dominant one that we know from its airport and from its presence in Western Germany. It had a medieval compression around an inside medieval vintage wall, and in the Vorstadt, or the suburb, that is the town in front of the walls or outside the walls, came a long Jewish crescent-shaped area that you see here. This was later absorbed into the Baroque era fortifications, which had sprouted barbicans and slanted walls in response to artillery. I'll talk about that in a little while. But you can see also that there was a jump in territory, garden areas and expansion, so that the Jewish ghetto area, which had been super compressed because of medieval pressures, now sort of stands out like a sore thumb, literally, in this newly expanded area of Frankfurt nearer the river. Here is the central ghetto here. It was dominated by a curving street known as the Judengasse, or literally the street of the Jews. It was dominated by a large new synagogue, which was built 1859 to 1860 as a sort of core for Frankfurt's Jewry. The whole Judengasse was subsequently demolished, and there seems to have been a sort of spread of the Jewish population more evenly through Frankfurt in the wake of this, as gradually the original medieval ghetto began to break down. But you can see it here really sort of clearly indicated in a photograph from around probably 1870. Now from there, of course, the idea of ghettos was perpetuated in Europe and probably reached its extreme levels in occupied Poland during World War II. Poland had a very large Jewish population. Of the 35 million in Poland in 1939, probably 3.3 million were Jews, and they already existed in ghetto areas because of friction between Jewish identity and the culture of the rest of Poland, which is in varying degrees, it was dominated by the Christian church, and particularly by Catholicism in Poland, even under the days when it was controlled by the Tsar. And in independent Poland, that tended to be perpetuated. These ghettos were, however, consolidated during the occupation, 1939 to 1945. This is Warsaw Ghetto, seen here in 1941, in which you could sort of get everyday life in the street. The bomb damage was essentially that of 1939, of the two-week siege of Warsaw in 1939, and would be followed, of course, by further massive damage after the 1944 Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which virtually resulted in 85% of Warsaw being flattened and the city basically being destroyed. Here, as you can see, you also get some sense of the urban pressures which were involved. The signs up above are warning you, don't stop, just keep driving through, nur Durchfahrt gestattet, because it's a solchen Sperrgebiet order is under placement for this particular region of Warsaw. That is, it's an epidemic zone. It had been declared an area of a medical emergency, and the Polish sign next to it says typhus is the disease, the flea-borne, rat-borne disease, which would account for so many people in concentration camps, was starting to spread through Warsaw at this time. There's the ghetto itself, into which 250,000 people were packed into literally a few streets in Warsaw itself. You can see the scale of the ghetto judging from the dimensions of the railway sidings and of details being marked out of individual buildings around central Warsaw. Vistula River is over to the top right, and the ultimately fairly untouched slum region of Praga is on the northeast corner. But this area marked in purple was certainly the epicentre for the Warsaw Uprising. It wasn't the only epicentre for Warsaw's uprising, but it was certainly a major location. And you can see from there, both in terms of German projections onto Warsaw, or Nazi party projections onto Warsaw, and indeed the identification of the Jewish population of Warsaw being compressed into that region, you can see certain correspondences with projections that were being made onto slum areas of London in the late 19th century in Charles Booth's survey. When you get up close, you can see that he loads onto his categorisations and his studies of particular streets attributions of social behaviour or of social positioning, with particularly, as you can see, the ultimate extension of the very poor being semi-criminal, so that criminality and wealth are connected directly. Now, this has relevance when the Americans begin to redline their cities in the 1930s, particularly, with very far-reaching consequences for inbuilt divisions in American urban development. And this too gets acknowledgement in some aspects of American popular culture. This is a scene from a film called A Raisin in the Sun. That is, you dry up like a raisin in the sun if you're not nourished or if you're not, in a sense, supported. It was a Sidney Poitier film at the time, where Sidney Poitier was constantly cast as angry young Afro-American in roles at this time. And this was about Sidney Poitier and his family getting out of the Chicago ghetto and moving into middle American suburbs in outlying areas of Chicago, most particularly a Levittown development. Now, Levittown, or Levitt's real estate agency, was a company that was subsequently identified with building huge numbers of project homes or speculative and quickly built small detached houses in American suburbs. Unofficially, they pursued a policy of discrimination and of actually keeping Afro-American families out wherever possible, but through various sort of slippages through the system, this family had managed to get in, and here they are being presented with barbecue implements and a letter of welcome from the local community. So in other words, yep, the transition is underway and is very much there, and Sidney Poitier looks pretty sceptical about the whole thing, really, in comparison with the rest of his family, and so the experience of the film will prove. And here was Levittown in action with a publicity photograph of the time, in which literally, yeah, an experience not unlike that of Melbourne suburbs in the same period. You literally met your neighbours over the lawnmower, really, or over the sort of through the blue smoke of the two-stroke engines and so on. And here's everyone having a bit of communality as they gather in their front yards, surrounded by their Levittown houses, which had names like the Country Clubber or the Commodore or other titles which were redolent of social aspiration, but which were very much a kind of the America that one feels has really had a reprise in the last presidential election, you know, when everything was all right. It was Leave It to Beaver territory. Nobody probably here would know what Leave It to Beaver meant, but it was actually a very popular TV series set in American suburbs in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and which I avoided watching on TV like the plague, but which I think really came to sort of stand for an America as desired by a very sizable section of the current American electorate, who look back on this era with rosy tinted spectacles of the days when you used to get out in your white t-shirts with your lawnmowers, and where thrifty and provident people who did the right thing as breadwinners during the day and would be committed to social stability would live out their lives in Levittown. And of course the Venturis engaged with this later on with Denise Scott Brown's article, Levittown, Learning to Like It, arguing that in fact there were aspects in low density American suburbs that were worthy of consideration and worthy of emulation, and that a rising tide of later anti-suburbanism in America was tending to in a sense cut out a lot of the positive aspects of those suburbs because of the the overtones that they had of ethnic segregation and of social dislocation implied in large suburban areas. And she argued that you could actually reconcile the two if you worked hard enough at it architecturally. And certainly from this depiction of Chicago in the 1930s, you could see how sharp the division now was between suburbs of the future Levittown variety and areas that were marked at the fourth grade. This fourth grade in these schemes was given the classification dangerous, and the implication was that those areas should, and there's a fairly far-reaching implication, these areas should be denied credit by financial organisations and banks as a result of their being dangerous. This was the series of maps which were put out by the American Real Estate Associations and the American Urban Development Association. This had come about, it was brought into being, funnily enough, as a New Deal proposal by which American cities would be rehabilitated and they would be pockets of poverty would be eradicated in American cities. But the result was more that of a mapping system which was then used to actually reinforce existing boundaries. It became known in the process as redlining, that you drew a line around certain sections of cities. They were red on the inside, and so in a sense they were off limits to, they became off limits effectively to social improvement or social development, at least in terms of capital available for works and money that could be directed to urban rehabilitation. Notice too how when you get up into the Frank Lloyd Wright zones of Frank Lloyd Wright, Walter Burley Griffin, Marion Marnie zones of Chicago up here along the lakeshore, there's only one red spot, I think, in the whole lot really, somewhere around Evanston, as I recall. And in actual fact, as you can see, the social divisions get marked out very carefully. This was done for most United States cities by the advent of World War II. They had charts in great detail in this patterning. Now with that, you also get the introduction of a gradual introduction of a kind of state of undeclared war that existed within American cities. Hence, as you can see in 2012, the Americans adapted what was, interestingly enough, a British software by which you could, I think it was a phone app or something like that, where we could, as you drove around, you could just track and make sure that you stayed out of the undesirable parts of American cities. There was considerable controversy over Ghetto Tracker, which was certainly a catchy title, and ultimately it was reformatted to have an Afro-American family laughing and smiling as the logo instead of a family from the land of Leave It to Beaver. And but it is interesting that you actually would get this permeating computer culture. But as I say, it actually came from a British system where you could track your way around the less desirable parts of Birmingham or Leeds or Manchester, and you could sort of stay safe and secure. Now, what were you working your way around? Well, it was racial, communal differences. To some degree, it cut in the direction of religion as well. This is Windsor, Ontario. This is the Canadian part, which is not really on the radar screen, as it were. But this was a division of Detroit, Michigan, which was, in this case, a result of a study done by Eric Fisher, F-I-S-C-H, and various others, which was ethnic populations in American cities. And he did a whole series, he and his team did a whole series of these. The blue section is Afro-America for central Detroit. There's an orange section, which was an Asian component, again at the edge of central Detroit with a small area over here. And the red sections were basically Anglo or Anglo-Irish or European American populations in outlying suburbs. In other words, it's a testament to so-called white flight that occurred in American suburbs from the late 1950s onwards. Not, of course, that the areas of the white flight were themselves without divisions either. And it's interesting to look at a film from the early 1950s called Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck in it, which was a transposition of a story which was originally written about Afro-Americans moving into outer suburban regions around New York. And this was shifted to become Jewish citizens moving into outer suburban areas around New York, at which point Gregory Peck and various others posing as Jews found themselves up against all sorts of barriers to buying land or even occupying or living in certain suburbs. And these included areas like New Canaan, Connecticut, which is where Philip Johnson has his house and his art gallery and so on, or had his house and his art gallery. And New Canaan, Connecticut, of course, was the setting for Ong Lee's film, The Ice Storm. In other words, it was one of those enclaves of brilliant people who were developing microcircuitry and virtually leading American technology. And it was set in New Canaan, Connecticut. I never went to New Canaan, Connecticut. You used to see the railway line arcing in from idyllic, hilly country, and it joined the main railway line from New Haven around about Stanford or somewhere. So it was this kind of semi-mythical realm that existed in the idyllic portions of upstate Connecticut. But it had discrimination enshrined. And the consequences of that and of redlining you can see when you look at Detroit now, where there's the CBD, there's Windsor, Ontario on the other side, which is still basically consistently populated, operating under a different system. Then the inner fringes of Detroit, as you can see around here, have become strangely thinned out. There are some old institutional buildings, such as a Richardson Romanesque church here, and some larger buildings that seem to have survived, but basically block after block has been mown down. The pattern was usual. There'd be progressive fires. Apartments would become run down. They wouldn't be able to get finance for repairs. The insurance companies wouldn't insure them. There was a dominance of slumlords, as they became known. And this became a phenomenon repeated in one United States city after another. Sometimes to get what insurance money was available, the slumlords would send in the torches. It was customary when I was in the United States that people would be told you would be wise to be out of your apartments tomorrow evening at the latest, and that was a cue for the torches to be sent in, and they would burn out the apartments. So you get block after block of bombed out, burnt out apartments. These would then eventually be demolished or bulldozed, and you'd get areas of rubble. And this is obviously what's happened in Detroit. It was certainly what happened in the Chicago South Side, that inner area of Chicago marked out as red, as we saw a few frames ago. And you can see what's happened in Detroit, where large areas of now grass has gradually grown over what areas which used to be very thickly populated with apartment buildings and houses. So in other words, you're getting a sort of a disappearance of the inner city. And the equation of the inner belt of cities with Afro-America has of course metamorphosed into American political vocabulary, so that when Americans talk about urban politics or inner city politics, what that means is Afro-American politics. It's a synonym for the two. Or what the Americans would call the politics of minority groups. So that, in other words, it has sort of permeated the American political and journalistic vocabulary as well as the development of urban surroundings. And certainly if you want to see what Ghetto Tracker is sort of guiding you around, all you really have to do is to go to Camden, New Jersey. I spent some time in Camden, New Jersey, because there was a notable architectural historian who lived in Cooper Street, Camden, midway between the Campbell Soup Factory and the RCA Victor Records factory. And the only reason we weren't all sort of, our cars weren't trashed or the house itself wasn't trashed was he was a drug rehabilitation psychiatrist by day and an architectural historian by night. So people tended to leave Ed Titleman and his family alone. But not too far from Cooper Street, you get Chelton Avenue here, which, as you can see, there's been just complete devastation. It's like the Wire, only more so, actually. It's like the Wire in Baltimore, which was, of course, the embodiment of urban politics in the United States, being a decayed railway city. And in this case, with Camden, New Jersey, yeah, it was... you could really sense it when you crossed the bridge. It was on the other side, the east side of the Delaware from central Philadelphia, but there were certainly enough bombed out areas in Philadelphia, particularly in North Philadelphia. And when I went back in 2010, you went through about 8 to 10 kilometres of bombed out suburbs west of Philadelphia when I went to stay with some friends in Drexel Hill. Over in Philadelphia's southwest, you just tracked through this whole sort of, this ring of urban blight which surrounded Philadelphia, the central city. And from there, it's not hard to see the condition that you also got, in which you used to see, you know, if you came in from a place like New Haven, Connecticut into New York City along the Grand Central line, it went straight through the South Bronx, and you just get block after block of these vistas, so that New York presented you on first sight, after a brief spell going through super plush Westchester County, you'd suddenly get presented with an image of Berlin in 1945 that I got the shock of my life, really. I had no idea that America really sort of functioned and was obviously able to live with and accommodate situations like this. This is an image photographed in 1970, and it involves apartment buildings on either side of Fifth Avenue. Now, we all know Fifth Avenue is sort of, you know, ranks with Mayfair. If Mayfair is the top spot on the monopoly board here, then Fifth Avenue is probably its counterpart in the United States. And but at the top end of Fifth Avenue in Spanish Harlem, you got these surroundings. You can see that some of the flats have already been burnt out and have the familiar covering of either gal iron or plywood put over the windows on the front. I'd never seen anything like this in my life when I went there in the late 1970s. And this photograph was taken in 1970 at the other end of the decade. One great institutional building after another you'd see with the familiar signs of absent glass from the windows and a sense that somehow they'd been gutted internally. The Divine Lorraine Hotel is in Philadelphia. It's in at the border of North Philadelphia and Central Philadelphia, which is of course the great city about probably 120 kilometres, 150 kilometres to the south east of New York, population 6.5 million. And but I was interested to learn that apparently the Divine Lorraine Hotel is actually in the process of restoration. It's being restored, but it's going to become a sort of talisman building. It will become an apartment building. It will sort of almost a Strivers Row building for a recognised Afro-American section of central Philadelphia. And of course the idea of cities that might then rehabilitate or in a way recondition or refurbish their buildings is something that again is of more recent origin. Prior to that, you had the idea that you actually demolished everything, you continued the demolition process, and then you replaced them with new build. And that had the immediate problem, of course, of stigmatising large areas of cities, or making areas, particularly the basic public housing that you find in sections of New York, for example, of making them instantly identifiable with poorer sections of the city. This was certainly the case with the austerity that characterised Robert Moses, M-O-S-E-S, and his huge housing developments in New York after World War II. And you can see them near the edges of various East River, Hudson River bridges around the edges of Manhattan. They tend to be. Down south it was another matter altogether. You didn't have the same volumes of population, but you certainly had very clear patterns of segregation, and an almost South African level of apartheid seemed to have existed in much of the United States, certainly up until civil rights legislation, and de facto and unofficially for many years after that, and in all sorts of ways persisting through to the present. Much of this occurred not simply in deep south cities like Mobile, Alabama, which is what you're seeing here, There was a series of photographs that distinguished photographer took of life in Mobile, Alabama in 1955-56, which you get some of these images here. But it persisted as far north as Illinois, Indiana, areas of the Rust Belt actually, major areas of the Trump constituency. It existed unofficially in states that were a long way north and were not formally obliged to convert themselves as the Deep South was, or as the former Confederate states like Alabama tended to be. You still found a lot of it, even in places like New Haven, Connecticut, where you'd find Afro-Americans would sit at the back of the bus, even around 1979 to 1980 when I was there. It was still almost an ingrained custom, so you actually had this kind of segregation. And New Haven itself was ringed by ghettos around Gough Street and Dixwell Avenue, where the Venturis built their amazing fire station in the middle, which never got graffiti damage or any sort of damage at all, which is interesting enough. I mean, that in itself speaks all sorts of volumes about the architecture that had been involved there. But certainly you get this whole world of apartheid that was, which is of course the Afrikaans word for separate development, and which we primarily associate with South Africa. But you get a great deal of it indicated, I think, and it comes up periodically, as of course in the recent film about NASA and the space developments, where once again in the early 1960s a lot of that apartheid was still in existence, certainly down in southern states, former Confederate states such as Florida. So here, as you can see, you get it everywhere. You get, for example, in Atlanta, Georgia, this was July 1962, the campaign to desegregate the Albany Hotel, with demonstrators outside and with the hotel being barricaded by members of the Ku Klux Klan, who of course were a clandestine organisation that sprung up after the American Civil War. Now with some of this, clearly the remedy was going to be replacement. There was another remedy, however, which became equally pervasive in American divided cities, and that was making the problem communities disappear. And one way that the Americans began doing this was in the National Interstate Program, which had been approved during Dwight Eisenhower's presidency in the 1950s. Eisenhower was not associated with segregation. In fact, he was the one who ordered the National Guard in to disperse and disrupt the segregated system in Alabama and elsewhere at the end of the 1950s, well before Kennedy or Johnson. But in the process, people quickly began to realise that the enormous areas that were being consumed by the interstate freeways could be harnessed to reshape large areas of existing American cities. This is New Haven, Connecticut. There's Yale New Haven Hospital down here, which had clearly been built end of the 1950s. Under Mayor Lee, L-E-E, there was an opportunity taken when I-95, which is the major East Coast freeway, was blasted through New Haven down here, which segregated the Italian and Polish areas on the east side of I-95, interestingly enough. Then there was a device called the Oak Street Connector, which was put through and would end conveniently enough with generous car parking spaces, and where a whole area, whole crowded and ghetto area of New Haven would be completely replaced with scattered high-rises, huge car parking areas and enormous areas of freeway lead-ins to go down and provide New Haven's major freeway entry to I-95. So the Oak Street Connector became an almost infamous embodiment of division by demographic change and the idea that you could actually make large areas of cities disappear through the process of beneficial public works. And I remember this was a real wasteland here. I used to do my shopping at Pignatero's shopping centre there. Behind that was Paul Rudolph's Crawford Manor, which was, as Vincent Scully described it, a tower of old folks in which all the elderly from surrounding areas were put up into a tower. And as for the rest of the population that had been in this teeming area to the immediate south of the central city, which is over here, they just disappeared. They went somewhere else. Nobody really knew where they went. Nobody really cared. They just went away and problem was solved. And of course it could be argued that something was implicit in that when you look at the lineage of drastic social alteration, which you get, for example, in Paris with Corbusier's Voisin plans. And the Voisin name itself was interesting. It was named after a French car producer. But ironically, the car producer had also been a maker of bombing aircraft during World War I, so that the name Plan Voisin had particular connotations in terms of what it meant for Paris, the city. Here's the Ile de la Cité. There's Notre Dame was there, and Saint-Denis here, and then the whole of central Paris, including the Hôtel de Ville, and certainly the avenue, the diagonal avenue to Charles Garnier's Opera, and a whole series of other buildings. These were all going to be obliterated in another wave of Haussmannisation, almost as sort of ferocious as the first 19th century wave, in which, of course, Eugène Haussmann's legacy, being 19th century and bourgeois, would be swept away and replaced with something much purer and more absolute, which, ironically enough, as you can see from its central plaza and airfield, derived from ideal cities of the Italian Renaissance, but now interpreted in modern materials and in modern forms. And for polemical significance, he juxtaposes that vision onto the rest of Paris, just to show the possibilities of the transformation. Now, what you also begin to see in this issue, because presumably the implication is here that once again large sections of the population were going to disappear or move somewhere else, is that again racism was a major component in social divisions of cities. Indeed, it seems again and again as if divisions within urban form are often predicated on racial, religious and other issues or related issues. This was a building called Hamann Square, that's H-O-M-A-N, which was a converted warehouse occupied by the Chicago police and used as an area for literally extraordinary rendition of Chicago's criminal population, petty criminals, people who really annoyed the police and who couldn't normally be arrested or brought into confrontation with magistrates in a conventional fashion, would often be just seized off the streets and housed in this building for long periods, during which time they would have appropriate reconditioning. They would undergo reconditioning experiences at the hands of the Chicago police. It was an extraordinary development, and it remains in action secretly for several years until I think it was eventually found out by the newspapers. And in that sense, it's not unlike the state level, the nation level institutionalisation of influx control and of the division of countries on racial lines, which was unfolding in South Africa. This is an image from the Sharpeville riots of 1960, disconcerting not least because of its resemblances seemingly to an Australian suburb with single-storey shopping centre with railway stanchions to one side and with streets of similar scale and openness. And Sharpeville was began as a demonstration against pass controls and against controls on people coming into South African cities according to the nature of their background or of their ethnicity. Passes had been introduced in South Africa in 1952 under the first of the apartheid prime ministers, Daniel Malan. 1948, 1954 was his prime ministership. And he'd been followed by two more apartheid prime ministers, Johannes Strijdom, Strijdom, and Hendrik Verwoerd, who was certainly the one I grew up remembering and was burned into my mind very vividly. In 1958 to 1966, Voerd, who'd been a professor of political science at Witwatersrand University and had very much inclined towards social Darwinism and towards the idea of ascendant nationalities and ethnicities, and applied this in his politics. He was assassinated in 1966, but he was followed by various others, and one can see Australian politicians getting positively misty-eyed in many cases when they think of the good old days in South Africa, particularly the case of John Howard, I think, who really had a soft spot at least for Piet Botha and Mr Forster and all those later prime ministers who succeeded Hendrik Verwoerd. Now, as you know from the apartheid system, which is an Afrikaans word, Afrikaans being the Dutch dialect spoken by Boer settlers or Dutch settlers in South Africa, A-P-A-R-T-H-E-I-D, apartheid, separate development. This pervaded every aspect of South African society, and it pervaded all the great cities. Here's a bus stop with Nur vir Blankes on the left and non-whites on at the centre in the further development. So you can see you couldn't even get the same bus. You had separate seats, you had separate beaches, you had separate public facilities. You also had separate sections of the city and separate sections of the towns. And you had the phenomenon which grew up under the National Party and its apartheid system of the provision of townships. These had origins under the old British Dominion rule in the 1930s and the 1940s, and they reached huge proportions. I can remember we lived next to a South African family for a time, and they would show us lavish books, glossy books of beautiful pictures of these new concrete block townships that the benevolent South African government was putting up in huge quantities in new suburban areas of South African cities. And this is Soweto that you see here, S-O-W-E-T-O, which became the epicentre for the gradual collapse of the apartheid system after major rioting and demonstrations when the government tried to enforce the teaching of Afrikaans, the Dutch language, which was seen by the African population as synonymous with racial discrimination, when they tried to enforce that as a subject of study in schools. I think it was around about 1979 to 1980. This is another development. This was Alexandra, or Alex for short. You can see once again more housing units provided by the apartheid era government, and then this extraordinary image which I talked about briefly last week and said I was going to show you. You can then see a huge shanty town development that seems to flow between all of those existing buildings like a river, literally like a tide, just sort of sweeping down across the whole suburb. And you can see clearly that the implications of segregation within South African cities. A key point in the official government development in Alexandra was the provision of single bedroom accommodation for single male workers brought down to work in the diamond mines, the coal mines, the gold mines, and the various other mining activities in those rich areas surrounding Johannesburg in central or northeastern South Africa. And here you see the male hostel, the male workers' hostel at Alexandra. This was the suburb itself had commenced around 1912, and then it rocketed ahead in development in the 1940s. Here are the police getting ready for a raid on the interiors. Some of the apartments had already been burnt out in this hostel altogether, and a glimpse inside the hostel, at least from photographs, is a rather hellish one, since the whole place was linked by a corridor that was only this wide. If you can imagine this slightly over a metre width corridor running for hundreds of metres down through the whole building in semi-darkness, given that a lot of the electricity was out. You just sort of it's like sort of a vision of hell, really. But not unlike what you would see in Chicago when you looked at the projects in the Chicago's south side and looked up into the towers. Again, sections of them would have been burnt out, and the whole place had a colossal din from ghetto blaster radio sets and things like that. So the whole place sort of resounded with huge levels of noise. If you then go to the Anglo-Irish realm and see what was possible when the Anglos and the Irish sort of began to mix it with each other, you also see similar divisions, levels of division possible, and you also see how those levels of division inculcated themselves into the ideology of a given city. And this is Belfast in Northern Ireland, dominated with these terrace house murals, which proclaimed the loyalties of individual regions within the city. Friends of mine who have relatives in Belfast say it's possible when you're in Belfast you can tell instantly the religion of a person by their clothing, by their faces, by just the way they walked, or their complexions, or their general demeanour. It was possible to isolate people according to where they stood, either in the Catholic hierarchy or the Protestant hierarchy. This is one of the Protestant zones here, as you can see, with a proclamation of the Ulster Volunteer Force, or the Ulster Volunteer Defence Force, and its dominance over this particular area, with presumably celebration of local heroes who'd sort of died in the cause of Protestantism and of no more popery, as the Reverend Ian Paisley used to proclaim from his massively popular and well-attended Protestant church in the region. On the other side, particularly around at the border of the Catholic areas, you then get Catholic figures, Roman Catholic figures, who are sort of hailed as heroes in all sorts of ways, sort of being cast in a kind of pantheon of heroism from one part to another, and really lining what's become a kind of Berlin Wall along one part of Belfast, separating sections of the city from another. And you get this generating a whole pattern of mural art. Catholic murals tending to be surrounded with Celtic strap work and patterning round about. And in this case, for these two lovable lads, that butter wouldn't melt in their mouths, you sort of get the impression. And this was, in this particular case, this was Jim Bryson on, as I recall, on the left, and Patrick Mulvenna on the right, who was Jerry Adams' brother-in-law, and they were Catholic martyrs, and so they were sort of celebrated. Their heroism was celebrated locally, with the harp of Ireland being almost a sort of symbol of the Republic, and the Red Hand of Ulster being a symbol of the Protestants. And of course you get the ultimate in division, Berlin's 1945 divisions, where the Soviet section of Berlin, which included the old city centre, developed here, and then there was an American, British and French division in various parts of what became West Berlin. It was deep inside East Germany. You actually had to cross through East Germany in a sealed train to get there, or fly over East German airspace to get to Tempelhof Airport. There's that enormous terminal that we've seen previously. And there's the zoo and the park area, which is up to the north of what became the new central business district, the Kurfürstendamm here, which was a substitute for the old Stadtmitte or urban centre further over. So in other words, the demographics of the city began to change quite radically, and this was consolidated in 1961 by the imposition of a cement block wall which ran through the middle of the central city itself. There it is, probably around 1989, when it was certainly covered with very brightly coloured graffiti on the western side, although as you can see it's very strictly segregated from Hamann, from vandalism on the eastern side, and is accompanied by a field of fires to prevent people from contagion, basically from ideological contagion, and from escaping and depopulating the Deutsche Demokratische Republik by fleeing to the west. So in other words, in this case, the idea of segregating the city was based on ideology and on ideological purity. When I was in Berlin in the late 1980s, the main concern was mainly about Westerners importing hard currency and distributing hard currency through the East German economy. They went to the most colossal lengths, checking your wallet and checking what sort of money you were bringing in and whether you had any Western currency on you. That seemed to be the main motive in the whole screening process when you crossed the border. But the changes to the urban form were quite spectacular in the cause of ideology. A surprising amount of the Leipziger Platz and Potsdamer Platz regions of Berlin, which had been the old Berlin epicenter before World War II, were completely obliterated. Buildings that survived World War II were demolished, so the wall could go through and it could have its accompanying field of fire. And of course these two squares have since been rebuilt and rehabilitated in later years, but really the idea of the Berlin Wall as a major revision of an urban form was quite startling. But it was an urban imposition based entirely on the belief that one ideology was necessarily so superior that you had to, in a sense, cut off one half of a great city from another just to preserve the purity of that ideology. Here's an image, I think this would have been from November 1989, when the guards tended to line the top of the wall, and I remember going over about 10 days before the wall came down and seeing the guards lined up in a similar fashion with a lot of crowds gathering outside. Clearly something was in the air, but nobody was saying much terribly explicitly, and with Karl Langhans's Brandenburg Gate isolated from the rest of the city by the wall, and Unter den Linden, the great east-west avenue in Berlin, immediately behind that. All right, I think we might have a break now. Okay, all right, we'll proceed with more jollity. There's the Anhalter Bahnhof, just by the way, but I think, I suppose this image of the Anhalter Bahnhof, of which I think one span survives, was indicative of another aspect of cities, and that is how they can operate as arenas of war. But not only that, that their form is radically affected by warfare, that they become fields for war as targets or battlegrounds. And so for a long time, of course, the history of warfare has involved particular cities being destinations for military campaigns. You can think Florence, Warsaw, Stalingrad, now Volgograd, Beirut, Baghdad, Paris, Moscow, Berlin, all of them have doubled as major targets or battlegrounds. Edinburgh has perennially. In the United States, although you might think that they're both deep within the United States, both Washington DC and Richmond, Virginia had been major targets for military campaigns, notably in the War of 1812 and in the American Civil War. At the same time, I suppose, so if you have cities as fields or as targets or as battlegrounds. You also have cities as instruments of war as well. First, in that city walls, although protecting the occupants of a city and, of course, dating back thousands of years, also became ways in which the cities would become instruments of warfare as well. That they would become almost weapons themselves. And you had the rise of war cities such as Carcassonne and Albi, for example, in southern France in the Mediterranean period. You also then had the idea of cities which, as a result of being sort of battlegrounds, began to sort of incorporate war into their ideology or into their identity. And this certainly was the case with London during the Blitz, and it was certainly the case with Soviet cities that were destroyed during the German invasion of 1941 to 44. So you begin to get the idea that cities might actually also become war industries. They would produce munitions, they would house the hospitals, they would house the drill halls and the marshalling grounds and the marshalling halls and the means by which military activity would be enabled. You also get, particularly when forts start to float clear of cities in the artillery period, when forts begin to sort of move further and further away from the cities they're protecting for various reasons, you begin to get them becoming gradually becoming substitute cities themselves, or what the Americans, I noticed recently, call surrogates. That they begin to take on urban characters in themselves. Detroit is one of the early instances of this, of a French fortress that embraces a city within itself. But you could argue probably this begins to happen almost immediately. You get artillery era fortifications with the late Italian Renaissance. Then, I suppose that might be a fifth area, then as a sixth area you actually get the idea of cities that deny that they're cities. In other words, the demands of camouflage, particularly when aerial bombardment comes in the 20th century, you begin to get camouflage to such a degree that cities actually begin to disappear as they cloak themselves in camouflage. And I'll show you a number of American instances where large sections of Seattle or Los Angeles were actually made to disappear by being shrouded in camouflage netting and having substitute suburbs or farms built over the top of them so that they actually became de-urbanised. Item 7, cities would be subordinated to wider plans, to plans that were larger than the cities themselves. And I'm thinking in particular here of the planned destruction of Warsaw during World War II. Then you have war generating often new towns or cities. These cities might not be necessarily military in themselves, but are part of activity stimulated either during wartime or in the service of some war or munitions factory. And that these cities, although not themselves theatres of war, are actually in a way derived from either the economic or the political stimulus given by war in various ways. And I'm thinking particularly of civilian cities or towns such as Mount Beauty in northeastern Victoria, which was 1941 to 1944 in its initial phase, or cities such as Welland Garden City, which start off as garden cities and are then militarised by taking on military production, or cities that are created from the outset for military production, most particularly Los Alamos in the United States. So we'll have a look at a series of these. This image from here that you see in front of you here is the children's Khorovod, which was a sculpture, a centrepiece for Stalingrad, as it was called, which was an ideal or modernist city or modern era city built under Stalin's aegis from about 1935 onwards. Romuald Lodko was the sculptor, Lodko, and it was rebuilt by another sculptor, Barmali in 2013, about the time that Volgograd, as it was renamed because it was on the Volga River, Volgograd, it's the capital city of the Caucasus, an oil-rich region desired by the German army greatly in 1942. It was finally rehabilitated and a replacement was organised since it had so much shrapnel damage from the, although it survived miraculously, all the fighting that went on round about it, this sculpture. Now, let's begin perhaps by having a look at walled cities. Now these, as you've seen, were a tradition from Mesopotamia and from thousands of years before Christ's advent, and they were necessary both as instruments of protection for the occupants of cities, but they also turned the cities into weaponry. They militarised cities. And you can see this happening here. The presence of a developed militarised city such as Carcassonne in France, that's C-A-R-C-A-S-S-O-N-N-E, dating from the 11th to the 13th centuries, was not only a city that celebrated the protection of its own occupants, but it also presented the equivalent of a feudal castle in the countryside. It presented an armed presence and a means of dominating the surrounding country area. And so walled cities tended to operate in this capacity. They were actually in themselves aggressive gestures, and they were gestures of dominance at the same time as the walls functioned to protect the people inside them, which is an interesting sort of two-way reciprocity in terms of the social and political role that walled cities occupied as late as the medieval period. Another case in point was the city of Albi. Albi was a centre for putting down the so-called Albigensian heresy, which had been associated with a group called the Cathars, who had the temerity to suggest such possibilities as ordination of female priests. This obviously was regarded as completely outside the pale of church authority, and the whole sort of tendency was put down with incredible ferocity in the end of the 12th, early 13th century, 1198 to 1218 to about 1229 or thereabouts, and with its final sort of celebration of victory coming with Saint-Cécile Cathedral, St. Cecilia, 1287 to about 1330 AD, finally finished, its tower was finally finished in 1492. There was a large tower at one end. And the cathedral, although ostensibly a church, is actually conceived as a castle form. It's conceived as a fortress cathedral in terms of its architectural rhetoric. This gave it incredible power in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, when people began rebuilding Albi Cathedral in various block-like church forms, thinking in particular of Robin Dodds' St Bridget's in Brisbane, or of the Bertram Goodhue, Ralph Adams Cram's churches in the United States, where Cram and Goodhue saw the church as beleaguered church civilization and what it carried through to us in terms of medieval civilization. They saw this as beleaguered by industry and by capitalism and by modern materialism, and so their recourse was to reinstate the fortress cathedral idea of Albi and bring it back to directly confront, in that case, American cities. But there were very similar recreations of Albi in churches in Australia. You think of St Dominic's Church in Camberwell, for example, or the block-like chapel, Trinity Chapel at the University of Melbourne, or the similarly block-like Newman College Chapel at the University of Melbourne, or of great sort of powerful, fortified churches of that character. And so when Bertram Goodhue, born the same year as Frank Lloyd Wright, I think 1867, and his partner Ralph Adams Cram the first architect to have his face on the cover of Time magazine in about 1926, Ralph Adams Cram. Cram in particular wrote of the need to reinstate medieval civilization, or Christian civilization as he called it, in which he saw the world as being dominated by a moral aristocracy. And he attempted to persuade Franklin D. Roosevelt to institute this order in the United States. I think Roosevelt obviously took it with a grain of salt, but yeah, sure, Ralph, yeah, I'll bear it in mind. And Cram and Goodhue themselves put forward what we now understand as modern Gothic, and they did this in a single campus, cum city. We'll talk a bit about the campus as a city next week. Goodhue's chapel was on one side, and all the campus buildings here, mostly by Ralph Adams Cram, here on the other. Dated from between 1902 to about 1912 to 1913, and its West Point was the complete rebuilding of the West Point Military Academy, which had been there since the 19th century with earlier buildings. They were completely demolished and replaced with this new neo-medieval utopia that was envisaged at the beginning of the 20th century. Here's the Hudson River, sort of winding its way around. So that's seen in Hitchcock's North by Northwest, where Cary Grant and Ava Marie Saint are having their seductive conversation. Takes place as the train circles around West Point and runs up the Hudson, heading for Chicago on the so-called water level route that the 20th Century Limited took from Grand Central Station. And there you can see the sort of Gothic that we would now be familiar with in 20th century Australian cities, heavily stylised, turned into block form, very much in line with reinforced concrete and with contemporary building technology, and church forms of that fortress on the hill character that you see with Goodhue's chapel riding above Thayer Hall, which is one of the main campus buildings further down. Cram being the architect for Thayer Hall, Goodhue being the architect for the chapel, which was 1902 to 1904. So in that case, as you can see, West Point was cast as a recreation of medieval values and virtues, but also it was drawing very much on the vocabulary of a battle city or a war city. And there were no shortages of those when you looked around Europe. This is Avila in Spain, the home of Saint Teresa of Avila, and her visions and her exploration of the mystical dimension of Christianity, which focused ultimately, of course, on her life in the city and gravitation around Avila Cathedral, which has its east end, or its chancel region, actually as part of the round turrets for the city walls that surround Avila. Along with Toledo, it's one of the two really spectacular sites that you can go to in reasonable proximity to Madrid in central Spain, in Castile. And those of you who are going to Barcelona should obviously go up into the enemy territory of Castile to have a look around some of those locations. It's also near Aranjuez, where of course Joaquin Rodrigo, the composer, spent his life as one of those sort of aristocratic landed gentry. So here's the church itself growing out of a winding, undulating city wall round about, and the power of the cohesion of fortified cities was extraordinary, and one to which later architects had constant recourse. And even in cities that don't immediately commend themselves to us as fortified, had this character. The Italian city-state was continually plagued by war between urban factions and between families, and so in a sense becomes another illustration of the internally divided city. And you see this particularly in Florence, where there was perpetual warfare between the great families and various urban factions. So the Palazzo Vecchio, 1299 to 1153, provided security for the city administration of Florence by virtually providing them with a kind of urban castle, which was hoisted up off the street. Means of access from the street were limited. You had to climb very high to get to the first rows of windows, and at the upper levels, so-called sporti or marcoliated or outward bracketed fortified level, meant that defenders could rain missiles down onto attackers in the streets below. This characterised 13th and 14th century palazzi in Florence for a long time. So the great families would often live in quasi-fortresses themselves, or would hoist themselves up into towers, as did the Alberti. And there's still an Alberti tower in Florence to this day, where they would just go up above the common people, up into their towers, hoist themselves literally clear. This was popular also in times of plague and pestilence and disease. But by the 15th century, obviously, these fortresses had become much more rhetorical in their nature. It was still very hard to get inside a big urban palace like the Medici Riccardi Palace, designed by Michelozzo in the mid-15th century, 1444 to 1484. But at the same time, there was now a lot of architecture directed at urban rhetoric, at making gestures that would be read very clearly by people elsewhere in the city or from other parts of the city. And this comes particularly through rustication, whereby the building is turned into a kind of a visual weapon, not so much a material offensive weapon, but certainly a strongly visual weapon, which would demonstrate both the greatness, the majesty of the Medici family, but also its resistance to popular tides and to rival families and factions, literally in the outward, the physical outward push of this rusticated stonework into the streets below. And this, of course, became ingrained as a palazzo tradition. So when you see urban palazzi in Australian cities, they invariably have these rusticated first floor, ground floor levels, which became characteristic of the three levels of palazzo form. Then the piano nobile, the upper level, and then the attic level above that, and then topping that with a giant bracketed cornice, almost sort of underline, except with the underlining being above rather than below the urban statement and the simple four-square cohesion of great family houses in Renaissance cities. Now, this is very much the realm of outer demonstration. When you get a precinct such as the Arsenale in Venice, that is the naval arsenal in Venice, where a large section of central Venice is actually handed over to buildings that served the Venetian navy and Venice as a maritime power, you get a functioning military structure and a system, but you also get it combined with all manner of outward gestures, particularly in the ceremonial gateways to the Arsenale that are down here. And when you come on these, you can see just how much is rhetoric as well as how much is the actual provision of the Navy. It was an extraordinary establishment. It employed 16,000 workers. It used early mass production techniques long before Henry Ford, by which components would be moved down a production line. And Venice was capable in times of stress of producing one adequate Mediterranean Sea-going military ship per day, apparently, out of this facility. At its entrance, you can see that there's appropriate architectural ceremony, and there are a series of sculptures that seem to have been set up almost like trophies in celebration of Venice's military prowess. This was, of course, somewhat ingrained in the Venetian psyche, given that their whole series of trophies from the Fourth Crusade against Byzantium or Constantinople ended up as ornaments in major civic sections of major civic precincts of Venice, most particularly the horses and the chariot on top of St Mark's Basilica, which had been plundered from Constantinople in the 14th century. So in other words, there's a functioning military role, and at the same time there is a rhetorical dimension which is transmitted at this point through the architecture. The same was true of Michelangelo's architectural interventions. He became fascinated with the design of artillery-proof fortressing and fortresses that would provide fields of fire for artillery. At the same time, he provided through his compositional capacities these extraordinary rhetorical statements of fortress architecture. This is the Porta Pia in Rome. That is Pope Pius's gateway, so named, which is full of all sorts of vaguely threatening and thoroughly mannerist gestures of arches overlapping with trabeation, with an exaggerated panel backing the sculpture up above, and with a gigantic Medici crest with balls on a shield, which was the standard Medici insignia, and then another shield up above that duplicates that. So in other words, it's an exercise almost in architectural rhetoric, in physical gesture, or almost facial gesture, that's being argued through architecture. This was on the inside portion of the Roman gateway. On the outside, it was much more fortification oriented. And when you look at Michelangelo's sketches for the period, you see his fascination with responding to artillery in this case, which had suddenly rendered conventional fortified walls obsolete because they could be battered down with artillery shells. And so fortifications now gravitated into extraordinary shapes. You can see how it obviously sort of appealed to Michelangelo as a major sculptor, so that in fact his fortification designs become sculptural exercises, and within those he explores possibility of crossfire from artillery and extraordinary patterns of kinetics, of lethal kinetics of warfare, which would be coupled with these sculptural forms. Now, as I showed you last week, this has been a characteristic of Francesco di Giorgio, and Francesco di Giorgio began designing and effectively completed a whole series of post-artillery, that is, after the advent of artillery fortifications, with these sloping or battered walls with embankments or embrasures, which became part of the new patterning of fortifications. And yet almost immediately he links that with propositions for urban form or for urban design. It's almost as if the two come integrally one with another. He doesn't seem to see the two as really separable at all, and he links part of the fortification dimensions with ceremonial entryways into the cities themselves. Now, this really gathers momentum in the 16th century. Here, for example, you have Civitavecchia, and then ultimately Palma Nova, which was developed as both an ideal city, as you can see, with a perfected geometric form and with radially disposed squares around a central convergence point, and where presumably those ideas of social organisation and hierarchy that had been advocated by Alberti were being put into effect. As opposed to Alberti's designs, which were either circular or square, you get, in this case, a polygonal design which is fronted at corners by highly developed barbicans, as they were known. Hence the name Barbican in London as a precinct of London, because it related to an old fortified precinct in which artillery would be placed, and in which the walls would lean backwards and be acutely angled so that you would increase deflection angles and thereby increase the resistance of walls to artillery fire. And also, as you can see, how barbicans provided all sorts of crossfire opportunities for attackers when you were dealing with sieges of particular fortifications. Now, with those, and they were also called bastions as well, you had a whole series of architectural types emerging in relation to artillery fortifications. This is Verona, scene of a series of Shakespearean plays, as you probably know, including the so-called House of Julia, or Juliet, which is in the central city. But it had a major artillery fortification put in by Michele San Michele, S-A-N Micheli, who was Venice's principal fortification architect. Verona was part of Venice, or the Venetos, under Venetian domination. And you can see here a series of bastions or barbicans that line the outside of the city running around one side. You can see, in fact, how it encompasses the zoo. And so when you go looking at the old fortifications, as I did back in about 1980, you're in front of the strange juxtaposition of San Michele's bastions on either side, and kangaroos and other animals hopping about in the gardens in between the bastions. It had been sort of delightfully overgrown by subsequent urban functions and roles. At the same time, San Michele celebrated the significance of the fortifications. As you can see here, earth berms, or once again walls that would absorb artillery harmlessly, or act as cushions for artillery bombardments, and then at closer range would provide walls for aimed muskets. When the soldiers began to get closer, they had to go down into these moats, literally, and then they had to climb another set of walls to get into the central city. The actual gateways, as with the Porta Nuova, as you can see here, which dated from around 1532 to 1540. Then incorporated a whole series of martial characteristics. The Doric order, the heaviest, the most powerful, was used as the favoured, and San Michele gravitated to the Doric most of the time, used that as the central order. He then made each gateway an extruded or extended version of a triumphal arch, in much the same way that Aston Webb had done with the Admiralty Arch in London in 1910, following to some degree what San Michele had been doing in Verona. At the top, you also had what were known as cavaliers, that is, round turrets in which artillery could be moved in various directions, rather like the gun turrets on ships, for example, in the 20th century. Those characteristics were incorporated. The wall's been broken open, as you can see at various points here. Most of it was brick. But the city's overgrown it, of course, and so you're getting these components left almost as isolated vestiges of an earlier order. Now, with that, I think you begin to see that, in fact, these fortifications had an implicit life of their own. They were starting to develop a stylisation, or a point between the city and the open country, which in a way provided a significant zone of transition and also to some extent a transformation of urban form. This extended during the 17th century and the 18th century, particularly under the Sebastian Vauban, V-A-U-B-A-N, who was principal fortifications architect to Louis XIV in France. Vauban's forts defended France in a kind of giant circle round about. This one is Neuf-Brisach, 1698 to 1707. And it's floated clear of the cities that it was ultimately protecting, given that really the object of protection in 17th century France was Paris and Versailles, which were well away. You can also see not only that, and Vauban's provided another one of these ideal gridded communities inside a main fortified area, but he's now started to spread the fortifications out into the country with a series of other components. Some of these were known as lunettes. For example, I think this would qualify as a lunette here, or half moon forms. And then further out as well, you would get other devices, such as in this case, you would get bastions of various sorts that would be isolated and would float clear altogether of inner levels of fortification. In fact, there are about 3 levels which appear here. Now, Vauban produced a series of these fortifications around the perimeter of France, Often they were 250 to 400 kilometres from the object of any attack on France, which would be presumably Paris and Versailles. At the same time, he was happy enough to come to terms with the existing cities where they were in a strategic location. A case in point being Lille, that's L-I-L-L-E. Verdun, which was of course the site of a major First World War battle, was another. Verdun was 1670. Lille, as seen here, was 1668 to 1672, so virtually the same time as Verdun. It was staffed by about 12,000 defenders, and you can see that the medieval town, which had a medieval encircling wall, was then supplanted with a series of bastion fortifications, which again seem to be floating clear from the original. And they ascribe the most extraordinary patternings in landscape, these great starburst formations, often combining pentagon forms. And of course the United States Pentagon, as constructed in the 1940s, was a tribute to the traditional role of the Pentagon as a core structure in 17th, 18th century fortifications. In the United States, that had a lot of association with the development of early European history in America. And so you see similar five-sided or four-sided forts, again with bastions at corners, often made out of logs, as in this case with the fortress of Detroit, which had been a French fortification and which had been taken over by the British and is painted here. During a siege, it was, I think it was, looks like it was one of Frederick Remington's paintings. It was painted it's painted to depict a siege during the so-called Pontiac conspiracy, Pontiac being one of the major Indian chiefs in the region. In 1763, Pontiac's rebellion, 1763 to 1766, which was eventually put down by the British. So in other words, Detroit was not only a protective structure for its occupants, but it was also a warlike structure which was produced specifically for the purposes of dominating the surrounding areas. It was hastily constructed from trees in the region, and then the trees were just felled round about to provide a clear field of fire against attackers. But it was also the point from which first the French and then subsequently the British would sail forth to dominate their particular area. Hence the name Detroit, which means straits between Lake Erie down here, and as you can see, Lake St. Clair at the top, which I think became Lake Huron subsequently. And inside, as you can see, it has streets, it has a settlement or a civilization. So it was very much a walled city, but at the same time it was a distant projection of power, given that the epicenter of French power, at least when it was developed by one Antoine Cadillac in 1701, was actually an outer expression of French dominance, which had its core at Quebec, which was hundreds of kilometres to the east. So in other words, once again, fortresses seemed to float clear from the original walled city. The walled city dissolved in the advent of artillery and of nation-state politics, and began to become both dispersed and also responding to the dynamics of artillery themselves. Now with that you get the development of military campaigns that focused on the accomplishment of a campaign or a war as gaining a city. We saw how, for example, Napoleon launched an immense attack on Russia with an army of about 400,000 with the objective of gaining Moscow. And of course, the Russians burnt Moscow so that when he got there, he just inherited a sort of, just a sphere of ruins, really. But you can see again and again that the objective was always a great city. Ironically enough, the Soviets, when they came to power in 1917, made their great objective the conquest of Germany, because it was the ancestral home of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and the crucial German entity for them was Berlin. So the idea was actually that ultimately Operation Bagration, which was the winding back of the Nazi invasion of 1941, would have as its culmination the taking of Berlin and the symbolic occupancy of the of the epicenter of the German Reich. So the idea of actually taking a particular city, which you also see was very much, I think, in the strategies of ISIL these days, was crucial in a whole series of wars. Hence the Franco-Prussian War had as its object an eventual siege of Paris in 1870 to 1871. The American Civil War was largely shaped because of the physical proximity of Washington, which had Maryland to its north side and Virginia to its south side, to the Confederate capital, which was moved to Richmond, Virginia in 1861. Richmond was only about probably 150, 200 k's south of Washington. So it was within what seemed all too easy striking distance. And so a whole series of battles erupted around the outskirts of both Washington and Richmond. 7 days battle around Richmond in 1862, and again the Petersburg battles, Wilderness and Spotsylvania battles under Grant in 1864, and a whole series of battles on the outskirts of Washington, notably the two Manassas battles in 1861 and 62, and Chantilly, which followed the second of the Manassas encounters, and then attempts to cut off Washington from the rest of the Union, which resulted, as I think I mentioned before, in the Antietam and Gettysburg campaigns of 1862 and 63. Finally, the Union Army got into Richmond, and the whole core of Richmond, apart from Thomas Jefferson's Virginia capital, which had been, of course, the Confederate capital for the last 3 or 4 years preceding, most of the rest of central Richmond was burnt out completely, as you can see. I don't think it was a fire started necessarily by the Union Army, but whatever the reasons, it joined the ranks of a whole series of southern cities that ended up getting burnt out at the end of the American Civil War. The same was true of Charleston, which got burnt out as well in 1864 after Sherman's arrival from the land. But Charleston had been protected by a series of forts well out in its harbour and physically well removed from the central city. One of these was Fort Sumter, and Confederate shore batteries firing on Fort Sumter marked the initiation of the American Civil War in 1861. Here's Fort Sumter itself, as you can see, facing out to sea, basically, and again adopting a kind of a pentagonal form characteristic of fortifications as they developed after the advent of artillery. You can see how fortifications floated clear. This is Washington. It's got Maryland on the north side. Baltimore's about there. Philadelphia's about up there. And Richmond was down in this direction. This is Virginia on the south side of Washington. Washington is put supposedly midway between north and south, although Maryland was also a slave state, as was Virginia. And in preparation for the war, Washington acquired a series of fortifications which are marked as the red spots on this map. As you can see, they don't seem to have trusted Maryland particularly either. There seem to be just as many fortifications on the north side as there were on the Virginia side that was occupied quite quickly in 1861. There was one rather big fortress that was put up in Arlington here, which is where the National Cemetery is. The present-day Pentagon is over in this region here, and Eros Arena's Dulles Airport is down at Falls Church here, and the two Manassas battles and the following battle at Chantilly were fought in this area here, 1861 and 1862. But in each case you can see that fortifications have moved right out of the city itself. Washington had no city walls, because the idea was that the countryside could now be controlled by artillery and by the placement of military in fortified enclaves outside. And so you found it at the early stages of World War I, when the German army entering Berlin through Liège, entering Belgium through Liège on their way to France as part of the Schlieffen Plan, ran into a series of dispersed fortifications outside Liège, and it was the ability of these Liège fortresses to hold out for 2 weeks that created the famed disruption in Count von Schlieffen's railway timetable plan for the occupation of France, and threw the German invasion into relative chaos while they attempted to subdue the fortifications that surrounded Liège in a sort of ring. This was in August 1914. You can see a German illustration of Liège and a series of the fortifications round about. The French also had a series of fortifications along the Rhine, and in the 1920s and the 1930s, after the Defence Minister André Maginot's proposal, they developed a gigantic fortified line that was going to protect France from Germany completely. Of course, what this sent out was the immediate signal that France wasn't going to venture out from behind this fortification, and that actually encouraged Germany in a lot of its aggressive 1930s behaviour. And it's not hard to see why, in fact, France wouldn't venture out beyond. When you see there was elaborate telephone bureaus, there was a movie or cinemas were provided at intervals along the whole fortification so you could keep up with the French film industry. There were convenient subways. All the amenities of a city were to be provided, including underground hangars for a nearby airport and so on, garages and other equipment. The attributes of a modern city were to be now placed underground, and one would fight the war as one might have from a medieval walled city, except protected by reinforced concrete and using modern artillery and higher explosives to keep the Germans at bay. I think the Germans got through the Maginot Line ultimately without too much difficulty in 1940, as it turned out. But primarily they went round one incompleted end of it in Belgium, and the whole thing scarcely gained any actual use. Nevertheless, I think the Maginot Line was predicated on the idea that cities themselves were now newly crucial, particularly at the scale at which large level military campaigns, often involving enormous conscript armies, were going to be employed. Hence, Britain in the 1940s saw London and Liverpool as prime targets for the German Navy and for German seaborne invasions, and so they too began to construct fortification networks. Very different from the Maginot Line, however. This was Guy Maunsell, the engineer Guy Maunsell, M-A-U-N-S-E-L-L, who developed the so-called red sand fortifications in 1942. These were used to some fame by pirate radio stations in the 1960s and became embodiments, funnily enough, of British counterculture in the hippie era in the middle to late 1960s. But they were built primarily as sort of gun turrets on stalks, a bit like sort of naval guns that without a ship. And they were probably forerunners in various ways for offshore drilling rigs and for more recent engineering structures of that type. And they're still sitting there covered in rust, as you can see, to this day. The guns have been removed, but their impact, I think, on aspects of British thinking was extraordinary. Archigram, as they began to develop urban proposals in the early 1960s, Ron Heron, Peter Cook and Michael Webb and various others began to develop walking cities that took the forms of Maunsell's fortifications and then made them the instruments of a projected city of the future, which could move around or change location. Everything could become metamorphic and endless and perpetually changing, and could do that through the mechanisation of large-scale urban forms. And I think the inspiration was very much Maunsell's fortifications, at least for the walking city proposals, which I think were about 1964, 1965. They were designed, there's a rendering by Ron Heron, who was one of the Archigram group. So you can see just what a pivotal role they had in British high-tech architecture. Notice too those immense hive buildings in the background, which presumably were apartment structures, which flanked these more mobile, quasi-insectile arthropod forms in the foreground. Now it's interesting to see how cities also operate as not only as celebrations of military or quasi-military victories, as here with the Karl Marx Hof apartments in Vienna, but how also they often unintentionally participate in the role of cities as theatres of war, that is, as battlegrounds themselves. And this was certainly the case with the Karl Marx Hof. This was an extraordinary block of about 1,500 apartments that was about 1.5 kilometres in length. So it would take you about probably 18 to 20 minutes to walk from one end of the Karl Marx Hof to the other at quite a brisk pace. So there's some indication of the immensity of Karl Ehn, E-H-N, and his design for what became known as part of the fabric of Red Vienna. After World War I and after the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved, Vienna found itself the capital of 7 million instead of 49 million, and so it had to readjust its perceptions of itself as a city and as a metropolis quite drastically. It also at the same time became the object of a mass urbanisation as people came in from the countryside and flocked into Vienna, presumably in the hope of clinging on at least to Vienna's living standards. The result was a population explosion, and the socialist government of Vienna, as distinct from the conservative and then ultimately fascist government of Austria itself, adopted a system of immense apartment construction, huge-scale apartment construction, in which something like 50,000 housing units were provided for incoming families during the 1920s and into the early 1930s in what has been described as Red, as in socialist, Vienna. And the Karl Marx Hof was one such. The name Karl Marx Hof was significant. Down the road, about 2, 3, 4 kilometres further away, was another huge Hof building of similar dimensions, the Friedrich Engels Hof, designed by Ludwig Perkow in about 1932, 1934. There were other Hof buildings scattered around Vienna in various locations. These included the Georg Washington Hof, the George Washington Hof, the Abraham Lincoln Hof. In other words, they would be named after heroes of liberation. And to some extent, this also pervaded complexes being developed by the socialist administration in Berlin as well. The notable one being, of course, the Onkel Tom's Hütte precinct, which was a suburb named after, literally, Uncle Tom's cabin. So it was a sort of source of liberation. It referred to Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel about the liberation from slavery and the hero, Uncle Tom. And it was retained because there was initially a tavern in the area known as Onkel Tom's Hütte, and the whole development was developed around that. But it proclaimed the victory of human rights over some pre-existing old order. And so that was very much woven into the agenda and the title and reflected the politics of the architects, Bruno and Max Taut and Otto Salversberg. At the same time, though, it was not uncommon for the Hof buildings to become battlegrounds, particularly during the Austrian Civil War of 1934, and with the politics in Austria gravitating towards fascism. Even the artillery was wheeled up eventually to attack machine gun nests that had been implanted in various of the Karl Marx Hof apartments. As you can see over one of the main arches here, the sculpture had been knocked off the arch and the building itself had been shredded by shrapnel and by gunfire from below, from the Austrian militia who had to fight their way literally into the Karl Marx Hof. And so there was a major sort of celebration at least in socialist circles afterwards, of what was known as the case of the Red Fortress, or Die Roten Festungen, the Red Fortresses becoming symbolic of socialist resistance to an incipient Austrian fascism. Now that role reminds us very much, I think, of the way in which reinforced concrete buildings, as there, were used or have been used in Beirut, and as they've been used in Aleppo and in parts of Damascus, and in that whole sort of unfolding spectrum of civil wars that have affected Lebanon, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East. As for Vienna itself, however, after fascism consolidated, and then after it was absorbed into the Third Reich in 1938, as we saw the proclamation of that last week, then suddenly Vienna turned into some sort of hyper-defensive city, which was in this case geared more and more to resist air raids and air attacks. And this came about through the disposition throughout Vienna of 6 flat towers, so-called, designed by Friedrich Thams, T-A-M-M-S. Thams went on to have a very prosperous post-war existence as a bridge designer, as an autobahn engineer, but obviously during the war he was doing his bit for the war effort, and Vienna acquired 6 of these flat towers. They were in 3 pairs. One would always be circular, the other one would be square. The square one is in the Gumpendorfer Strasse, which is near the Maria-Hilfer Strasse, which is at the edge of the ring outside central Vienna. The ring, remember, we saw last week. Further over in the Auergarten, in the Auergarten Park, that's A-U-E-R-G-A-R-T-E-N, you've got one of Thams' circular towers. As you can see, once again, they have cavaliers in the tradition of San Michele, in which very large flat guns were mounted, and these could fire more or less as they would from the gun turrets of battleships, except the buildings were built in monolithic but reinforced concrete. This has made them almost impossible to demolish. I think Berlin still has 4 of its original 6, and Vienna has, I think, its entire 6, and I think Hamburg has 2, which had been provided by Thams during the 40s, and as far as I know, they're still there as well. So you get them sort of sitting here. In the case of the Viennese ones, they've often been converted into kindergartens. One's been turned into an aquarium, but they're used as kindergartens and daycare centres nowadays, which is rather endearing. And there was even a couple of Inspector Rex episodes, needless to say, which had their denouements and people racing around and inside and on top of these flat towers as the episodes were sort of brought to their sort of thrilling conclusions. At the same time, you also get cities that were conceived for civilian purposes, then they become often unintentionally battlegrounds, and then the legacy of those battlegrounds gets absorbed into the ideology of the particular city. Now, a leading case in point was Stalingrad, named after Joseph Stalin, the benign father of all the Russians, who'd sort of replaced the Tsar as a father figure and a dynamic personality. And you can see images of Lenin and images of Stalin posted on the Stalingrad streetscape, photographed here around about, I think, 1938 or 1939. Now, as we know, it was the capital of the Caucasus, which was an oil-rich area, and so it gained a visit from the Germans in 1942. The Russians were determined that the Germans wouldn't get any further. Here they are outside the ruins of the tractor factory, which was between central Stalingrad and the river Volga. As we know, the Russians decided they shall not pass any further, and so an immense resistance was mounted and a 6-month campaign which resulted in the isolation and destruction of a complete German army. After that, Volgograd as Khrushchev renamed it to demolish the cult of personality that he associated with Stalin, appeared. Interestingly enough, the arcading of some of the buildings actually reminds me of some of the buildings in Beijing, particularly the hotel that I was in Beijing, with arcading running along. And in fact, there was a team sent from Soviet Russia to advise on the coordination of the 10 crucial buildings that were going to be built in Beijing during the early Maoist era. So here's Volgograd as it sits now, recreated, and its ideology, coupled with an immense war monument of a female figure holding a sword, which I think is probably about 100 metres in height, nearing 100 metres in height, and crowns a tall hill, really has become part of the city's identification, its city as battleground. Now, Warsaw also became the capital of the Polish Second Republic, 1919 to 1939, also became another battle city. Whether it quite got that sort of identification with heroic defence in quite the same way is another matter, because the defence took two phases. One, the 2-week Polish resistance in 1939, where about a third of the city was destroyed, and then the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, coupled with the Polish Home Army in 1944, where an extra quantity of the city was destroyed, so that ultimately 85% of the city was actually demolished and destroyed during those 4 years. But that's not to say there wasn't actually a plan to get rid of Warsaw in its pre-war metropolis sense anyway. Here's one of the major streets recreated as part of, as you can see, a complete software which has recreated Warsaw as it once was. It has about the feel of a Melbourne city street in many ways, cross between that and perhaps Chapel Street, Paran, only a bit wider. And it was all demolished, it was all flattened, almost all of it was flattened in the intervening years. So that by 1946, as you can see, this girl looks out over what appears to be a series of sort of mounds of garden, but in actual fact rubble from buildings, which was a measure of the level of destruction that happened in Warsaw, central Warsaw, after 1944. There had been plans, of course, to convert Warsaw. It was going to be reconfigured as Gartenstadt Warschau, that is, Garden City of Warsaw, a provincial city for the servicing of German farms to be established in the new and newly occupied Polish territories. Gartenstadt Warschau was to have 130,000 people, Germans, on the west side of the Vistula River, and on the east side 80,000 Poles who would come in and work as servants and domestics and would live in the Praga region on the east side of the Vistula River. The city was to be coordinated with a system of modern autobahnen and freeways, and so it was to be completely modernised, and in plan form, as developed in the so-called Pabst Plan, which was developed between July 1939 and February 1940 by Hubert Gross and various others, Hubert Gross, G-R-O-S-S. It was very much a modern city. It was very much like a modern layout, as with, say, the satellite cities of Canberra, conditioned by freeways and by the car, and where the population would be reduced from 1.5 million to about 210,000. So in other words, it was going to be an instrument of de-urbanisation at the same time as being an act of urban transformation. Another instance of a city which is dragged involuntarily into becoming an arena of warfare, and by implication the embodiment of warfare, was Nuremberg. I've never quite known the significance of Nuremberg's of Nuremberg within the Third Reich, except that Richard Wagner's Meistersinger, the Master Singer's opera, was set in Nuremberg and was full of prescriptions about how German culture would triumph and would keep itself pure from contaminations, as you hear in Hans Sachs's famous final song near the end of about hour 5 or hour 4 of the opera itself. You finally get the punchline. So here it is now, and as you can see, quite a number of the buildings have already been taken out in aerial warfare. Now, the Third Reich response to Nuremberg was both to capitalise on the existing medieval city. So you see a lot of medieval Nuremberg, that medieval Nuremberg in Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph des Willens, or Triumph of the Will, 1934, which concentrates on rallies being held outside, the new rallies being held outside Nuremberg. Gradually, as time went on, a whole series of structures were developed to augment these rallies during the 1930s, particularly under the aegis of Albert Speer, S-P-E-E-R, who was Hitler's principal architect, had a major role in the design of Germania for Berlin, and later on became his munitions and supply minister. This was his Zeppelinfeld, named after Count Zeppelin, who developed the rigid airship in Bavaria before World War I. This is conceived as both architecture but also as a kind of quasi-urban precinct with an immense rallying ground, with architectural effects being provided, in this case by batteries of searchlights which scan the sky, presumably looking for interlopers from hostile countries. So in other words, the building itself, the design itself, becomes a celebration of militarism or of militarization. In some ways, though, of course, it's very much the roofless room that's conceived as part of urbanism during the 20th century. It was known as the Cathedral of Light, since it presumably had overtones of bringing light and enlightenment, as well as scanning the skies for enemies. And it was part of an enormous complex that was developed that would extend Nuremberg outwards through a series of, as you can see, a gigantic Congress Hall, which was half built and still there to this day, near the Zeppelinfeld, which was, that previous image was photographed from somewhere around about there, I would say, looking about across the assembled mass SA personnel in the foreground to the lights, which would then project upwards. But as you can see, there were even greater concepts further over and rallying grounds, and a gigantic open-ended stadium at one end that was to be almost 2 to 3 times the size of the original 1934 projected buildings. In between, symbolically, were a series of what looked like city blocks, but were actually pine forests. So in a sense, the pine forests and the magically enhanced landscape of the German forests, streams and nature, the realm literally of Siegfried as he embarks on his journey towards the Rhine in the third of Wagner's Ring operas, is embodied in all the surroundings of these precincts. But they too were extensions of Nuremberg itself. Hence, of course, poor old Nuremberg came in for the treatment, although I don't think it was particularly strategic, and I don't think it was much of the city was focused on munitions production. But here it is, next to the Pegnitz River. And of course, demolition on this scale, destruction on this scale has just become all too familiar, so that you go from there into the age of reinforced concrete, and you see Beirut in Lebanon, and this view here next to the former Hezbollah headquarters, photographed sometime early at the beginning of this century. Now, I think we might leave aspects of the city as the embodiment, or as a theatre, or as a realm of war, or as military activity. I think we might leave it there. We're reaching 3:30. We might, though, just have a quick talk about some of the issues that have come up before we head off.